How did you get into car design?
I mean, coming from where I'm from, it felt like, a moonshot. VW in the 90s and the early 2000s was kind of a golden period.
So where did the Curvv design come from?
It's not really a big surprise that it was an Italian origin.
Who came up with the name Curvv? Are you excited about working on a Curvv Racer? It's 1.5, 2 years since you showed us the Avinya concept.
That's right.
Why did it take so long to get to eventual production?
Next year, that will be the big story after the Curvv.
Welcome to the Evo India podcast. Now, it would not have missed your attention that this has been a week of SUV coupes. We've had the Basalt at one end, we've had the Lamborghini SE at the other end, but the SUV coupe that hopes to make this entire system, the genre, mainstream is the Tata Curvv. And obviously, it's a design-led concept. It's a genre that focuses on design. And who better to talk to us about SUV coupes in particular and car design in general than Martin Uhlarik, the global head of design at Tata Motors. Martin, welcome to the Evo India podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me over.
Excited to finally get the car on the road?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we've been working on it for what seems like a super long time. But now it's like this is the moment where we're going to finally see it on the road and in the public.
So what's taken SUV coupes so long to become mainstream? We've obviously had it on the X6 and, on luxury vehicles. But yes. Mainstream SUV coupe, why so long?
I think it's just like because it was seen as a niche. It was seen as essentially like a non-practical typology, that there was a little bit of hesitation about bringing this sort of vehicle into the market. And like you said, most of the ones that were a coupe were at the high end of the market, whereas we've decided to actually position it right in the sweet spot at this 4.3 meter sort of segment, which is really the core of the SUV market.
So you've not designed the Curvv as a niche product. This is going to be a volume product. What did you have to do to make it not niche?
Well, what we did was, first of all, the positioning, size. Price obviously will be a massive factor in terms of making it appeal to a mass audience. And the fact that we didn't compromise in functionality. When people think of a coupe, they think, it's a purely emotional product. But we didn't compromise the second row, ingress, egress, headroom, volume, boot space. So in many ways, those were non-negotiables, and what we're offering is a car that has everything that a mainstream product has, but that added layer of emotion, of that wow factor, which is, it is essentially a coupe sports car.
You told me that this was your COVID project. We're going to come to that in a bit, but first I want to talk a little bit about your personal journey. When did you start off at Tata Motors?
I started in June 2016. I was initially the head of the UK studio, and when I joined, the project that was on the desk, as you speak, was the beginning of the Punch design development. So that was the first program I worked on.
So as head of the design studio in the UK, what would your role entail?
Well, it was to be responsible for whatever projects were in the UK studio at the time. Obviously, we have the three studios, Pune, UK, and Italy. That hasn't changed over the course of my career. And in my responsibility for the UK, it was whichever program was being developed at the time, also to make sure the proposals from the UK were competitive, and to come up with any new ideas that might be interesting for the company.
What drew you to Tata Motors?
What drew me to Tata Motors? I had known the studio for a long time. Obviously, as a designer, you're kind of well-versed in terms of who's where, what studio has what role. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought it was interesting. I also thought about the journey that Tata Motors is about to embark at the time in terms of its development. I also saw the investments that were coming into the company from a product development, but also studio development. The studio you visited in the UK was on the drawing board. And it wasn't hard to imagine, the growth of India as a market. I had worked for a Chinese OEM prior to that, and I had, been part of that growth in terms of the China market and that company. And I saw a real sort of, parallels. This is the next big frontier. To be honest, over the course of my 30-year career, I have always been, you could say, a bit of a pioneer in terms of going to, I would say markets that are about to flourish. So my first company that I worked for was Skoda. And I worked in East Europe at the time. That was, not seen as, maybe the most, attractive company. But I saw always the potential in it, and I've always had a little bit of an adventurous spirit in me. And so I thought this is just the right place at the right time and an opportunity to really be part of something great.
How did you get into car design?
How did I get into car design? Well, I was always drawing cars in my math books, much to my family's, frustrations. And I was always interested in art. I was always good at art, but I could never connect the two, that there was actually, a car design career. I always thought it was mostly architects in Italy, Giugiaro, Gandini, who were basically, doing that Ital design, Giugiaro, Pininfarina, the traditional sort of carrozzeria. And so I kind of fluked into it. My art teacher at the end of high school told me to visit an art school exhibition. And they had a course which was industrial design. And that really fascinated me. But it was the usual, like chairs, tables, product design, that sort of stuff. I thought it was really interesting. But then at the end of the show, there was one student who did a quarter scale clay model. And it wasn't very good. But to be honest, it kind of blew my mind that you could do this. And he showed me the brochure for a college in Pasadena called Art Center. And this was a school that really specialized in car design. And that was it. Right at that moment, I knew that's what I'm going to do.
And back then, that was one of the preeminent schools.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, that was one of the premier...
Getting into it must have been difficult, or?
No, it was. It was very competitive. And to be honest, I actually went to the school. The one I was mentioning was in my hometown of Toronto in Canada. And I ended up studying there for 4 years. I have a degree in product and furniture design. And I used that as basically a prep to apply to the school in Pasadena. And then I applied there and I graduated. They had a campus in Switzerland. And for me, that was like a Mount Olympus, to be able to get into that school and, graduate and become what you could say is a car designer. I mean, coming from where I'm from, it felt like, a moonshot. I thought like that's so far away. So it was a real kind of Mount Everest for me.
And what was your first job?
So my first job was Skoda.
Oh, so Skoda was your first job?
Yes, right out of I graduated, I think it was like end of July, and I started at Skoda 5 weeks later. And to be honest, when you're graduating, you don't really know even what country you're going to live in, let alone what continent. And so I put my portfolio together, got a kind of a student rail pass, did a tour around Europe, and interviewed at a ton of companies. And Skoda was the last stop, literally, on that trip. And they offered me a job right away. And initially, it was a 3-month sort of, let's see how it goes. And actually, my initial plan was to do the 3 months and then probably relocate back to North America. And 30 years later, I'm still living in Europe.
So you never worked for an American company?
No.
At Skoda, you worked on the first Octavia?
Yes, first Octavia, but the real program that I really worked on, immediately I was put on the Fabia. Okay. So first generation Fabia. I was an interior designer at the time. And so I worked on the first generation Fabia, Octavia, and Superb. So the first, the foundation stones of what became the company that we know today. And I was there 7 years.
7 years.
Yeah.
And at Tata Motors, you started off with the Impact 3.0 vehicles?
That's right.
What was the Martin touch that you brought to those cars?
I think the what I brought to the table was my experience. By that point, I was working 20 years plus in the industry. And I had worked, obviously, for a German-Czech company. But remember, VW in the 90s and the early 2000s was kind of a golden period for the group. And even though, we were focused on the Skoda products, quality was a massive part, especially interior quality. So it was a real benchmark in terms of just consistency, discipline, and attention to detail. And then I spent 11 years working for a Japanese company. So with Nissan, Japanese companies have a real focus, again, on quality. To be honest, it was never good enough. Whether it was just surfacing on the exterior, PQ, interior fit and finish. And at the same time, Nissan was a very open, creative company. Each model is uniquely different. They really emphasize individual, design for each product. So I brought that experience to Tata Motors. And the thing that I really focused on with the Punch, regardless of its price point, it doesn't have to be a luxury product, was fit and finish, PQ, especially on the interior. I really wanted the Punch interior to look like a Japanese product. So, but obviously it's a collaborative effort. There's, tens and hundreds of people working on the product. So you bring your inputs, bring your advice, your guidance, and it's a long process. It's, a 2-3 year process to deliver a program. Even once you have a theme, there's a lot of finessing of the theme. It's like polishing a diamond. So I think what I brought was the polishing effect.
Okay. Was it hard to make that mindset change? And obviously you had to work with existing components. You couldn't redesign everything from scratch. Was that hard?
Yes, but it's kind of part of the game. And to be honest, I mean, most of my colleagues also have a rich experience. So if I thought of the people who worked on that program, they had worked internationally as well, and they were also bringing all of their experience to the table. So it's this like nice fusion point, this critical mass that's happening. And once the product boils, then you have the recipe.
So coming to the Curvv, you said it was your COVID project.
Yes.
Talk us through it, please.
Yeah, so obviously during the pandemic, we were all working from home, and we have 3 studios, but at the time we had 180 studios. So everybody is an individual studio working from home. So a big challenge was coordinating everybody. But we were in the sort of cycle plan where we were upgrading the entire cycle plan very quickly. So if you think about the last 12 months, we've launched 6 products. So since last September, Nexon EV, Harrier Safari, Punch.EV, and now the Curvv. So if you think about it, all of those products were, basically in development all at the same time. And so there was a lot of coordination. But the Curvv was the one where, to be honest, it wasn't just a traditional facelift or, an upgrade. It was actually the opportunity to do something really new. I think there was also a little bit of an itch that a lot of our designers had, was to do something a little bit more, just exciting. And so the idea was like, why don't we investigate a SUV coupe? And then by the end of 2021, beginning of 2022, we essentially presented it to management. And we obviously, when you present a design, it's not just the design, the visual of it. Like, management goes, oh, that looks good, and we discuss it and review it from a proportional or design point of view. But there was also the product planning aspect, which was like, is there actually a business case? Is there a market for this? And definitely, once we did the math as a company, we saw the potential in it. We saw that there's a niche. Tata Motors has always had a pedigree of white space products. If you look at the portfolio over the history of the company, it's always actually kind of created segments. So it kind of fit the narrative of what the company is, Tata Motors, and it just kind of looked like a complementary product. And if people say like, well, 4.3 is the core of the SUV market, I think there's something like 12 products in that segment right now. But you think, why would you come into it with what you would call a niche product? But we're coming into it with a product that we think is actually going to be a big seller. But we also have another product in the pipeline, which will be, complementary to the Curvv. So in many ways, it's almost a double whammy.
Yeah, we'll come to that next product, and that's something that we're really excited about. But on the Curvv, so it wasn't like a management diktat that you got that we need to design an SUV coupe. It was something that came from the design studios.
Yeah, and in many ways, I mean, the design department isn't just, that we get a brief. We do get that a lot, where, company product planning identifies a segment or a product that we should be doing. You get the brief, and then, you work with engineering to develop it. And when we develop it, it's like first proportions, platform, what is the right size, overall ergonomics. And then, of course, there's the styling aspect. You have to make it attractive and beautiful and good quality. But there's also another half where design does a little bit of white space brainstorming and proposes. There's like the shelves full of models in the studios of products that, will never see light of day. But in many ways, it's a good way to provoke a discussion with management. And to be honest, design has that USP, is like when it presents an idea, it's a physical model. So we either present a quarter scale or a full size, and then it sparks a discussion. It's sometimes an easier discussion than around a PowerPoint, where you have a lot of data and you'll have a lot of analytics. So usually it has to be a kind of double-edged sword. You have to have the intelligence, the market intelligence, but you also need that emotional appeal. As soon as you put a model in front of management, it really gets a discussion going. And when we showed the Curvv, for sure, there was a lot of discussion.
And you also have to have engineering on your side, because you design a 4.3 meter SUV. If you don't have the platform for it,
That's right.
then what do you do, right? So do you push engineering actively that, okay, we need this by, say, in the next 4 years, 5 years?
Oh, yes.
How does it work?
No. We have a department called APC, Advanced Product Creation, which is an engineering wing, which is essentially platform development. And design works with this platform team because we know, that you're not only creating one model, but you're creating usually a portfolio of models around a platform that has a certain scalability. So when you're developing a product, design in many ways audits the platform. So we will cut a full-size model, and then we'll look at it proportionally, but you also have to make an ergonomic model. How is it being used? So in the case of the Curvv, initially, we had a shorter wheelbase, and we made a recommendation that we need a longer wheelbase. That helped enable the C-pillar to become much faster, but it actually helped primarily is the second row, ingress, egress, and essentially all the overall space in the second row. So this is something that we create, and then we have these properties that design can model. And then we can have a discussion with engineering and management. And then, of course, again, if we say we need a wider track or longer wheelbase or shorter overhangs or whatever the recommendation is, again, it goes through almost like a calculator, in terms of, okay, this is the right decision. What does it mean? Is this improvement going to be something that the customer can value and benefit from and so forth? So it's part of the process.
Was it hard to convince management of an SUV coupe?
Not really. Actually, if I think back, I didn't see any real resistance to it. Actually, it was a fairly seamless product development. If I think back over the course of it, I don't remember much turbulence at all. It's kind of just like it was presented, and all of a sudden, I just seem to remember it was already on its way.
Okay. You've got 3 design studios. Do you have a design competition where you have you give a brief and then all the designers work on it, or just a select few designers work on it? How does that happen?
Yeah, I mean, I always encourage all 3 studios to work on it. That's the point of having a global organization, is to get different perspectives. Pune studio will give us, a perspective from the home market in terms of what they see is the right type of product. UK studio will give us, a different one, and an Italian studio will give us also a very unique proposition. The Italian studio is probably the one which is the most remote from the 3 studios. So it is the farthest satellite, if you think about it like a solar system. And so sometimes it has the least amount of inputs, but then you get the freshest ideas. But each one is unique. So I always encourage all 3 studios, regardless of the program, to make proposals. And in terms of the designers who are available, I mean, there's already programs, on the go in each studio. Each studio right now is delivering a full production program as we speak. So it's an open competition. The program then for production is allocated to one of the 3 studios, but whoever wins the design, we usually encourage them to follow it through. I'm a big believer that the person who came up with the original sketch should actually see it all the way through, because they're the one who will fight for it the most in terms of the passion. It's their theme, and they will have the most investment in it.
So where did the Curvv design come from?
So the Curvv design, the exterior came from a designer in Italy. So I think it's pretty clear that it's a pretty emotional looking car. So it's not really a big surprise that it was an Italian origin. And the interior was from the Pune studio. So it was a combination of, again, and that designer then, the program was then developed in the UK. As soon as COVID lifted, we were cutting the full-size models in the UK studio. And all the programs actually eventually land in the Pune studio. The Pune studio has to deliver a program, but at the same time, they are always on the receiving end of every program in the cycle plan, because they have to then work with manufacturing, usually the suppliers, and just getting it ready, in many ways land the plane.
That's because Pune is based at the factory, and that's why they do the final finishing?
Yes, there's an element of, getting it prepped for manufacturing, but also then the PQ. There's a lot of still finessing at the end of every program when you're building the last prototypes. the beta models and so forth, where there's still something to be done. I mean, we were, still tweaking the Curvv right up to the last minute.
Why didn't this go to the Italian studio? You said that the designer that does it, that studio gets it.
At the time, the Italian studio was full. They had another program on their books, and so they are actually the smallest studio. And each studio can deliver a certain amount of programs.
So coming to the Curvv, you said that it is not niche. Now, what were the key elements in not making the Curvv niche?
Yeah, so making it not niche, it first of all has to be somehow understandable. Design, you can't just design for, I would say, a 1% or a 10%. You have to make it look like anybody could relate to the product. So in many ways, is the Curvv a coupe? Is it a sort of emotional sedan? It's a kind of, product that people can understand in terms of what it is from a typology point of view. And then, like I said earlier, it doesn't compromise on the practical aspect of it in terms of usability, in terms of a day-to-day driver, in terms of second row space, comfort, the boot space, and so forth. So I think it'll add something to the market, which people just didn't realize that it was the answer to the question they didn't know they had.
Yeah. So how much of design is about giving people what they want or giving them something that they did not know that they wanted?
Yeah, this is always a really good question. I think this is a dilemma that most creative people struggle with. You want to make something that provokes and, wows them. But at the same time, you have to make it that they can process it. So design is an interesting discipline. It's, like I said earlier, you study design in an art school, but it's not art. It's an applied art. It's usually a collaborative project. You're not doing it as a singular artist, where you come up with something and then, like, when you go to an art gallery and you look at a piece of art and you go like, what is this? And you need to process it, and maybe it takes years for people to appreciate it. Obviously, in a design industry where we're creating an industrial product, you can't have that sort of, I don't want the product in 10 years, they'll go, this was ahead of the curve, but it didn't sell because nobody understood what it was. This has to be a product and a design that people can appreciate, but at the same time understand. And that's always the balancing act between design. It's like that sweet spot between, like, people go like, wow, that's new, but then it's like, I get it.
Who came up with the name Curvv?
Oh, this was usually when we come up with a name, we engage with marketing. We do a kind of workshop, and we have a whole list of names and stuff like that. But actually, the name of the Curvv was born out of the image board that one of the designers had. One of the designers was an avid downhill skier, and so they had like carving skis. And we said, the Curvv, in terms of agility and cutting the corners, and again, that sort of sporty, capability. And they just had this word carving. And I think we were playing with that name when we were doing the concept 2 years ago. And then, of course, marketing took it on. And of course, you have to make sure that you have the copyright to it and so forth. But it was kind of born from that, the verb of carving.
What's the one design element on the Curvv that you're most proud of?
Well, the best view is the rear three-quarter. If you stand at the rear three-quarter, it's just the sort of the C-pillar coming down, the body side being very clean, but then it's the taillights that are this almost like an extended spoiler. It's super simple, very easy to understand, really clear, very modern.
Is it difficult to put that into manufacturing?
Should be. Every design that we do should be a challenge. And, every time we come up with something, whether it's engineering or our suppliers or manufacturing, it should be a challenge, to put it in. I think if we were just repeating ourselves, the customers would be bored very quickly.
What was the most difficult thing to get right on the Curvv?
Most difficult thing was just to make the car look natural. 4.3 is a fairly compact size for a coupe. And like I said, to do that balancing act between the package and making sure it looks natural from a coupe point of view, that was the real challenge. There was a lot of work done just over the head where the second row is, making sure there's the headroom, the flow, the C-pillar, and then there's a spoiler. There's also a camera. There was the hinge point and so forth. So all of that there was a little bit of sweat there.
Was it also a focus on efficiency, aero efficiency with the coupe profile? Do you put this in the wind tunnel, for instance?
Yeah, all of our models go into a full-size wind tunnel. There's a lot of CFD, which is, basically doing aerodynamics digitally. But at the same time, we always put our clay model into the wind tunnel. And the designers go into the wind tunnel for a couple of days. I remember doing this when I was a designer. And it's actually kind of it's kind of a black arts where, you add a little bit of clay and they run the test and the aero team says, oh, this is working. Or the numbers are negative, and then you actually take off, whether it's the plan view, whether it's, surfaces, sharpening up the rear, making things smoother, even small subtleties, a couple of mil here and there will make a huge difference. And it's always the sum of its parts in the overall CD number. But it's an interesting process, that's for sure.
The Curvv will be both an ICE and an EV. It's going to start with an EV. Are there any challenges to doing a car that can take both powertrains? Or let me put it this way. If you had the freedom to do an EV-only Curvv, could you have gone a little crazier?
Crazier is it's hard to gauge whether we would actually go crazy. But definitely when you're doing an ICE and an EV combination product, a Gen 2 product, there is always a little bit of a challenge because it's a median between, two platforms, two powertrains, and also two different sets of attributes. Usually with the EV, we're trying to emphasize more efficiency, aerodynamics, overall, range. And then with an ICE, you have to always package, the engine and the transmission and so forth. So, of course, it's a kind of balancing act between the two. And, of course, then you have the business case. What is the change content between essentially two products? But yeah, like anything, any design program, there's always a set of challenges that you have to, overcome.
I know you're an enthusiast. Are you excited about working on a Curvv Racer?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. We're already thinking about that. That's for sure.
What's the first thing that you do? Put bigger wheels on it?
Well, that would be my first recommendation, definitely.
So is there a lot of friction, or maybe not friction, but pushback from engineering? Designers always want bigger wheels. Engineering wouldn't want it because of longevity, because of market requirements, ride comfort, for instance.
Yeah, of course.
Right?
Those are all legitimate concerns. And I would say friction is a good thing. Friction creates heat, which is something that people are attracted to. So I think, it's like the left hand talking to the right hand. I'm left-handed, so whenever I go to an engineering meeting, most of the people I'm talking to are right-handed. So that's quite a natural process. And yes, we bring our inputs from a visual point of view, from an emotional point of view. We're in many ways an avatar for the customer in a certain way. And at the same time, engineering brings their concerns, which, like you itemized, are all legit, but you have to find the right balance.
With the Curvv, was there anything that you couldn't get through into the car?
Well, if you remember on the concept, one of the things that we had was the bonnet had a cutout. There was air going through the upper grille into the bonnet. In the end, actually, once we did this in the wind tunnel, we found out this was a huge investment from a cost point of view, complexity. Actually, it gave us nothing from an aero point of view. So then it was like, well, it looks visually cool, but ultimately this has no merit whatsoever. So this was dropped fairly quickly. And this is the sort of process as one item, that you can see, like where you have a dialogue.
Talking about concepts, you told me a long time ago that Tata Motors no longer does concepts for the sake of doing a concept. When you do a concept, you always have a production intent to it. When did that happen?
I think it's more of a resource challenge in the sense, but for me, ultimately, it was like, I'm not interested in doing concepts that are going to end up in a desk, in a drawer. I actually want to see every idea that we come up with on the road. So the challenge for the designers is come up with a production car that looks like a concept. And for the engineers to, engineer a production car that looks like a concept as well. So at the moment, we still preview our products usually 1.5, 2 years out with a so-called, in quotation marks, concept. Ultimately, I would like to I always say we're going to hit singularity, where we're going to have one launch where we basically just drop a product and that's it. What you see is what you get.
If memory serves me right, it's 1.5, 2 years since you showed us the Avinya concept.
That's right.
And when we saw that looked like a concept. Yes. It doesn't look like anything you would see on the road. Do you think that has production reality that customers would actually look for something like that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the production car of that is in development right now, and we're getting very close to design freeze. And I can promise you that when you see it, it will be as impactful as what you saw 2 years ago.
That's crazy.
Yeah,
I'm really looking
and I'm really
forward to
even
that.
today, like coming on my way here to the studio, I was just looking, out of the window at the landscape and the car landscape and all that. And I keep asking myself, I wonder what that car will look like on the road here in Pune, and it won't be that far away.
It will turn heads for sure, because there is really nothing that looks like that. But another thing that will definitely turn heads is the Sierra.
Definitely.
That concept was shown at the 2020 Expo. Then you showed the EV concept of it. And I believe the design freeze has already happened.
Yes.
Almost going into production. It's very soon. It's around the corner.
Yeah.
There's a lot of emotion around the name. Of course, at that time, the design was also really good. I was a kid at that time, and I remember seeing the first time I saw a Sierra. It was like, wow. It was a very emotional, desirable product. To translate that into something that will work today. It didn't work then because it was a 3-door. It had limited practicality. Also, Tata Motors was new into making cars. Today, everything has changed, right? But how do you take something from the past, from an iconic past, and make it relevant for today while still retaining all those emotional elements?
Well, that was the challenge. I mean, you saw when we unveiled the concept in 2020, that was essentially a proof of concept. And it had a completely different roadmap in terms of platform. At the time, you could see a lot of punch DNA on that 2020 car. And it was literally a concept. But the reaction, you remember, was immense. Yeah. And that actually underlined what we always felt was there, that there is an emotional DNA, an X factor around that product, that if you can harness it in the right way, you have a massive potential product, in it. And then, of course, at the last Auto Expo, we unveiled the EV version. That is essentially the product that we're going to be. That was the EV version of the car. And to be honest, you've seen the concept when you visited us in the UK studios in the reception, just in front of design. But if I showed you the production car, you would be hard-pressed to tell the difference. I think that's going to be the best example of what we were talking about previously, of that our concept and our production cars are really it's literally millimeters. It is completely different in terms of every surface mathematically has moved, but at the same time, if you saw it, you would go, that's it.
Why did it take so long to get to eventual production?
From the 2020?
Yeah.
There was actually a massive shift. Well, first we had the pandemic. And the priority, around 2020 was, upgrading the existing portfolio. So as we said, Nexon, Harrier, Safari, creating an EV version of the Nexon, creating an EV version of the Punch, and now introducing the Curvv. You can immediately say that's like getting your house in order, priority list. And then with the Sierra, we were working on that all the way through. But there was another thing that was a massive shift was the electrification of the portfolio. When we were working on the 2020 Sierra, the concept, it wasn't really part of the narrative. And when we showed the show car, the one you saw in the UK just recently, you can see that was already with an EV platform. So the proportions have changed, and I actually think that the second version is a much more refined design, much more modern, and actually the transfer of platform actually created even a better proportion for the car in terms of the wheelbase, in terms of the overall height, in terms of the width. Just overall, it just looks like a much more mature product. And then it was just, the last 2 years has been working on the production car. And like you said, next year, that will be the big story after the Curvv.
And it's also to get the back end ready in terms of the engineering, in terms of the production also, having the capacity to put it out.
Like I said, resource is also something you always have to prioritize. At the moment in design globally, as we speak today, we have 9 projects on the go globally. So 9 production cars are being worked on this morning in all the 3 studios. So it's always a priority list because it isn't just design resource. You have to have the engineering resource and you have to calibrate it, to synchronize the whole company, to gear it up. So There is a cycle plan. It's in many ways, that's the music hymn sheet. And, it's like an orchestra. Every instrument, every person in the orchestra knows their part, when they're supposed to start, when they're supposed to finish, and so forth. And then, of course, you have the board, which is the conductor, which makes sure that everybody's singing in harmony. So it's like a huge, complex machine that's working constantly.
ICE to EV. What advantages or challenges does EV give you vis-a-vis the ICE that you've been traditionally working with?
I actually find pure EV, Avinya will be the first pure EV product which has no ICE derivative. I find it to be actually extremely liberating. There's a lot of hard points that vanish by an EV. The skateboard, the platform is much simpler in terms of overall proportion, in terms of overall hard points. There's no transmission tunnel. The cockpit all of a sudden is enabled a lot more from an interior design point of view. And in general, just overall proportionally, it comes across as a much more future product. So definitely designing EV products is much more easier as a designer. Even though for me as an enthusiast, I'm a petrol head, but at the same time I drive an EV, and I have to say it is also a very rewarding experience. Even though I do need still a petrol car.
So that was an ICE versus EV. But all your cars, all Tata Motors cars have got excellent crash safety ratings. Yes. Now, when you design, do you also design for crash?
Absolutely. I mean, crash is one of the big pillars of our brand. So, when people think of Tata Motors, they think of safety and design. And, definitely we are a pioneer from a safety point of view. So it's, again, a non-negotiable. All of our products have to have the highest safety ratings.
What goes into it?
Well, actually, it's pretty challenging as a designer. There's a lot of end cap hard points. So if you're designing the front, it's a pedestrian impact. So for instance, the chin has to be in a certain point. There's a number of hard points that you have to adhere to, where the surfaces are, the bonnet. If you, unfortunately hit a pedestrian, the way the pedestrian will fall onto the bonnet, onto the hood of the car. Make sure that the radii will not create, a secondary impact on the head and so forth. So if you think like everybody has to adhere to these same hard points, it's a miracle that all the cars on the road don't look the same, because everybody has to follow the same parameters. So that's the challenge from a design point of view, is actually meet these hard points, but at the same time create still a unique design vocabulary.
Okay, so I've got a couple of personal quick-fire questions for you, Martin.
Let's do it.
Okay. Where do you draw your inspiration from?
Everywhere. 24/7, everything in my life. I get inspiration from walking down the street, reading a book, watching a movie, fashion, architecture. Like I said, I'm a product designer originally. So everywhere, everything inspires me.
The most iconic car design?
Oh, a most iconic car design. I have a top 5, top 10 list on my phone.
Okay, let's go top 5 then.
Okay, top 5. Honda NSX, first generation. Ford 012C. This was a concept car that Ford did with a product designer back in the early 2000s. I think it's a real exercise in simplicity. Ferrari 308 GT4. This was probably the only Bertone designed Ferrari. I love the 70s generation of Italian supercars, and I was always a massive fan of Bertone. Then Porsche 928. Okay. Very unique design, unbelievably timeless. Whether it's first generation or an S4, we can have that discussion. but overall, that's that. And then from a fifth point of view, I think most designers will tell you that a 911, regardless of which generation, will probably be up there. And again, it's for the timelessness of the thing. Ultimately, when I think about that list, other than the Ford, all of them are essentially sports cars / supercars. I would add even a car like the original Fiat Panda. If you see the concept, which is in the Automobile Museum in Turin, it's an exercise in brilliant simplicity in terms of the interior, how it was designed, the use of materials, making a cost-effective people's car. But I could go on and on.
Would it be your dream to design a sports car at Tata Motors?
Oh, for sure. For sure. I'm always trying to uncrack that bottle.
Do you hope within the next 5 years it would happen, within the next 10 years?
Oh, within 10 years, definitely. It's just a matter of when and how. And like you said, even with the SUV coupe, that we're doing just with the Curvv, there's a right place and a right time, and there's a right moment for everything. But as a designer and an enthusiast, of course, that would be ambition.
Can a sports car be an electric sports car?
I think so. I think this is something that everybody's asking themselves. If you look at most of the traditional, what you would call sports car makers around the world, they're all now dabbling in electrification. If you make it a cabrio, I think there's an added element where, the sort of wind in your hair experience kind of fits with an EV.
Most iconic car designer of all time?
Well, Marcello Gandini, who passed away just recently, I would say is up there in the on the Mount Rushmore, Mount Olympus of car design. I would add Giorgetto Giugiaro. Those were two people who really were kind of gods for me. And then they would be like right up there.
The gods of bike design.
Gods of bike design. Well, I would definitely put a shout out to my brother, who's a motorcycle designer. In terms of bike designers, I'm not so well versed in terms of in terms of individuals, but there's definitely a couple of bikes that I would put up there.
Which bikes? Top 5?
I'm not sure if top 5. Yamaha VMAX, Yamaha MT-03, the original. That's, again, my brother's design. Oh. Then Ducati 900. Remember the BMW K1000? Yeah, that was pretty impressive. I remember seeing that as a kid on the road, and that kind of blew my mind. Those would be right up there. Maybe Yamaha R1.
Yeah. What gives you the greatest joy in your line of work?
Oh, greatest joy is, first of all, it's not work. This is my hobby. I can't believe that this is my job. Like I was saying, as a kid, I was drawing cars in my math books. I would be doing that regardless. But, so the fact that this is actually your job, even regardless of, the challenges, like you said, you're going to meetings, there's cost meetings, there's engineering meetings, all that. But that's actually the thrill. That's kind of like the action.
So let's double down on that. What's your biggest frustration?
Biggest frustration is actually, that you have to navigate. You have to justify why this design is important. But that's actually that's part of being a designer. You always have to, you argue. So in many ways, the role of a designer isn't just coming up with the creative ideas and designing a product, but actually saying this has value.
What's the biggest handicap that you have to work with?
Biggest handicap I have to work with? Don't think there is any. There's so many positives of the job in terms of you're doing a creative job. It's something that's very appreciated by the customers. It has value. I mean, obviously, I believe that. I get to travel the world. Over the course of my career, I've worked in so many different cultures with so many different countries and people. I mean, in many ways, design is my passport more than even my real passport.
What's your personal ambition?
Oh, personal ambition would be to leave a legacy of products that people will look back on with a lot of fondness and have a body of work where you really made a contribution, not just to the various companies that you're working for, but also as a designer to the industry and leave a kind of legacy, whether there's a group of designers that are kind of following your aesthetic.
Yeah. What are you most proud of in your stint at Tata Motors?
I mean, a lot of products. I would say, looking back, the Punch was the first product I worked on. And, I worked on that now 8 years ago, if you think back. And here we are today. It's the best-selling product in the market. And it seems to just be generating, speed in terms of, people's appreciation. I think this product it kind of ticks the boxes in terms of legacy, in terms of what I was talking about. And then looking forward, I mean, if I look at the next 3 products that we have in the pipeline, or 4, I mean, they're all super exciting. Always the next product is the best one.
Tata Motors has a lot of history behind it, right? You obviously are now well versed with it. There are these iconic nameplates. Safari has come back.
Yes.
The Sierra is coming back. What's next? The Sumo?
well, I can't say anything about, potentially models. I mean, but those were always seen as the living legends, in the portfolio. You could even add the Nano to that discussion in terms of, iconic products. But in many ways, every product that Tata made, from the Indica onward, were iconic and have a special place in people's hearts. So in many ways, you could pick up any of those legacy nameplates and make a new product. At the same time, we have to be careful that we're not a retro design organization, that all we're doing is kind of just rehashing it. You always have to be a forward-looking company. So, even if you take a nameplate like the Sierra, which is, something that we've already confirmed, the reality is it can't be just nostalgia. It has to be 100% forward-looking, but with the character of the original car.
And finally, Martin, how do you deal with criticism? Do you want to tear your hair out and these Neanderthals don't understand design? Why are they criticizing something that we're working 5 years on?
Oh, yeah. No. It can be frustrating. It can be very emotional. You put a lot of your heart into the design of a product. And then you read the feedback in the forums and, somebody might say, I don't like that, or that looks rubbish, or, why did you do this? And it's very easy to get defensive, as a designer. You should be emotional as a designer. But at the same time, design is subjective. Everybody has an opinion. When we do a design review, we can have the professionals looking at it. But in many ways, the cleaning lady, if she looks at it and says, I like it or I don't like it, her POV is as important as anybody's. So it's important to take that criticism with a sort of pinch of salt. But at the same time, you really have to defend it like in a court of law. And in the end, the success of the product, the success of the designer will be in the numbers, the sales numbers. And it is an emotional business. So, of course, you're going to get, reactive to it.
Thank you, Martin. And I hope the Curvv generates the numbers that you are proud of. It is interesting. It is a little path-breaking as well. And it will look very different on the road. It will add a lot of color, shape, and differentiate it to all the cars on the road. So all the best with that, Martin.
Thank you. I have no doubt that the car will make a massive impact on people when they see this thing going down the road. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you for being on the podcast, and thank you for watching the podcast, listening to the podcast. If you have any more questions, if you have opinions on the Curvv, which Martin will probably pull his hair out over, let us know in the comments, and thank you for watching.